I got home just after 7 in the morning, exhausted, filthy, and running on the kind of caffeine-fueled survival mode that anyone who's ever worked factory overtime knows all too well. My shift had been supposed to end at midnight, but one machine failure turned into another, and before I knew it, I had spent 14 straight hours on my feet. All I wanted was a shower, a hot meal, and maybe 4 hours of sleep before doing it all over again. Instead, I pulled into my driveway and nearly drove straight into my mailbox because something felt wrong. At first I couldn't place it. Then I saw it. My driveway was empty. Completely empty. My old Ford pickup was gone. For a second, I genuinely thought someone had stolen it. I jumped out of my truck and stood there staring at the cracked concrete where my pickup had been parked every day for nearly 15 years. The only thing left behind was a dark oil stain and a bright orange sticker plastered across my mailbox like some kind of public humiliation notice. I ripped it off and read the words twice because they made absolutely no sense. Vehicle exceeds residential height restrictions. I remember actually laughing. Not because it was funny, but because my brain refused to process the stupidity of what I was reading. Height restrictions? My truck had been sitting in that exact spot since before half the houses around me even existed. The truck wasn't pretty. It had dents, scratches, faded paint, and enough miles on it to circle the earth several times. But it was paid for, reliable, and earned me a living. To me, it wasn't an eyesore. It was a tool. Apparently, somebody disagreed. Across the property line sat the Cedar Ridge Estate subdivision, a neighborhood that had appeared about a decade ago after developers bulldozed farmland and replaced it with rows of identical gray houses. Every lawn looked like it had been trimmed with surgical instruments. Every driveway contained shiny SUVs and luxury sedans. Everything was perfectly organized, perfectly controlled, perfectly artificial. The people there loved rules almost as much as they loved telling other people about those rules. When I called the towing company listed on the violation notice, the guy on the phone casually informed me that my truck had been removed at the request of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. For $100 to get it back. For $100. After working overtime all week. My exhaustion instantly turned into anger. I drove straight to their clubhouse without even changing clothes. The HOA board happened to be holding one of their monthly meetings, which looked less like community governance and more like a wine-tasting event for people who enjoyed feeling important. When I walked inside, conversation stopped. Several people looked at me the same way someone might look at mud tracked across a clean floor. Then the HOA president stood up. Her name was Denise Harwood. She wore an expensive tennis outfit despite looking like she hadn't willingly broken a sweat in years. She folded her arms and smiled the kind of smile that wasn't actually a smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. I held up the violation notice. "You had my truck towed." "Yes," she said calmly. "It violated community appearance standards." I stared at her. "I don't live in your community." That's when she dropped the bombshell. According to her, a boundary adjustment approved years earlier had extended HOA oversight to several adjacent parcels, including my corner lot. Apparently, buried somewhere in county paperwork was language giving them limited authority regarding visible property conditions. Whether that claim would hold up in court was another matter entirely, but Denise wasn't interested in discussing legal details. She was interested in power. "Your vehicle negatively impacts neighborhood aesthetics," she explained. "Residents have complained." Residents. Translation: people who got upset whenever they were reminded that actual working-class people existed. I asked why nobody had spoken to me first. No warning. No letter. No conversation. Denise shrugged. "According to standard procedure," she began, speaking slowly as if explaining basic math to a child. "The board determined immediate enforcement was appropriate." That phrase stuck in my head. According to standard procedure. Funny how people love procedures when they're the ones making them. I paid the towing fee that afternoon because I needed my truck for work, but the whole drive home I kept replaying the conversation. The arrogance. The entitlement. The certainty that they could simply reach across a property line and control someone else's life. What Denise and her board didn't understand was that they had picked a fight without bothering to learn who they were fighting. 20 years earlier, long before Cedar Ridge existed, a telecommunications company had approached me with an offer. They wanted to install a small signal relay tower on the back acre of my property. The arrangement was simple. They paid monthly rent. I maintained access to the site. Everybody won. Over the years, I barely thought about it. The checks arrived, the equipment quietly did its job, and life moved on. But standing in my kitchen that evening, staring out my back window toward that tower, I suddenly remembered something important. Very important. During one maintenance visit years ago, a technician had explained exactly how much local infrastructure depended on that relay. Security systems, smart garage openers, remote gate controls, connected doorbells, network-dependent automation. Most people never think about how these conveniences work. They just expect them to work. That's the thing about dependence. People don't notice it until it's gone. And as I looked toward Cedar Ridge Estates glowing peacefully beneath the sunset, I realized the HOA board had just made a very expensive mistake. Now, before I tell you what happened next, let me pause for a second because this is where a lot of HOA stories get interesting. Most people assume an HOA can do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, simply because somebody in a polo shirt says so. That's usually not how things work. From a legal perspective, HOA authority is only as strong as the documents and agreements behind it. If someone isn't clearly bound by those agreements, enforcement becomes a whole different conversation. That's why disputes like these often explode into expensive lawsuits. But honestly, the legal side wasn't the most fascinating part to me. The psychology was. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere, not just in neighborhoods. When people gain a little authority and spend years without being challenged, they start confusing power with legitimacy. They stop asking whether they should do something and focus entirely on whether they can. Denise and her board weren't really upset about my truck. The truck was just a symbol. It reminded them that there was one property they couldn't completely control, one homeowner who didn't fit their carefully managed image. The lesson here is that conflicts about rules are rarely about rules alone. Most of the time, they're really about status, control, and who gets to decide how everyone else should live. Unfortunately for Cedar Ridge, they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The next morning I woke up after only a few hours of sleep, made a pot of coffee, and walked out toward the back section of my property. The relay tower stood exactly where it always had, quiet and unimpressive against the morning sky. If you didn't know what it was, you'd probably drive right past it without a second glance. That's the funny thing about critical infrastructure. The most important things are usually the least impressive to look at. I unlocked the maintenance enclosure and stepped inside. Years earlier, one of the telecom technicians had shown me the emergency shutdown procedures in case of equipment damage or unauthorized access. I wasn't vandalizing anything. I wasn't destroying property. I was simply exercising authority over equipment access on land I legally controlled while a separate lease dispute remained unresolved. At least that's how I justified it to myself at the time. I looked at the breaker panel for several seconds. Then I reached out and flipped the switch. Nothing dramatic happened. No sparks. No alarms. Just silence. I locked the enclosure, walked back to my house, sat on my porch, and waited. Around lunchtime, the first signs appeared. Cars began stacking up near the subdivision entrance. Residents got out of their vehicles and started pressing gate remotes repeatedly. Nothing happened. The gate remained frozen. A few people climbed out and manually pushed it open. Others stood there staring at their remotes as if glaring hard enough might fix the problem. By late afternoon, the community Facebook page had already begun melting down. One resident reported that her garage door wouldn't respond. Another complained that her smart security system had lost connection. Someone else blamed hackers. One particularly dramatic post suggested a cyber attack from a foreign government. Apparently, that seemed more believable than the possibility that their neighborhood wasn't as technologically invincible as they imagined. By evening, the security company contracted by Cedar Ridge had dispatched technicians. I watched their trucks arrive. I watched them leave. Nothing changed. Day 2 was when inconvenience turned into panic. More garage systems stopped responding. Doorbell cameras went offline. Remote access features vanished. Homeowners who relied on smartphone-controlled systems suddenly discovered that modern convenience has a very short expiration date when connectivity disappears. The complaints multiplied. The HOA board issued statements promising swift resolution. Contractors arrived. Engineers arrived. Consultants arrived. Everyone collected fees. Nobody fixed anything. Around noon, I received my first phone call from Denise. Her voice sounded noticeably less confident than it had during our clubhouse meeting. "We've been experiencing service disruptions," she said carefully. "Really?" I replied. That's terrible. There was a long pause. We're aware of your telecommunications lease arrangement. Are you? Another pause. We would appreciate your cooperation. I almost laughed. Cooperation. Funny word. It hadn't appeared anywhere in their vocabulary when they were towing my truck. I told her I was busy and hung up. By the third day, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Parents were complaining that automated pickup systems weren't functioning properly. Residents who worked remotely were furious about intermittent service issues affecting home equipment. Elderly homeowners dependent on connected monitoring systems started demanding answers. The community message boards became digital battlefields. Every hour brought new accusations, new rumors, and new demands for accountability. Then came the visit. Around 6 in the evening, I looked out my front window and saw 4 vehicles pulling into my driveway. Denise stepped out first, followed by several board members and a man wearing what looked like an expensive business suit. Their entire group marched toward my front door with the determination of people who had finally realized they weren't in control anymore. I opened the door before they could knock. Denise wasted no time. This has gone far enough. Has it? I asked. The attorney stepped forward. We're here to discuss restoration of service. Interesting, I said. Last week you were here to discuss my truck. Nobody smiled. Denise's face tightened. Residents are suffering. That's unfortunate. You're intentionally interfering with essential systems. Am I? I asked. Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like your residents built an entire lifestyle dependent on infrastructure they don't own. That hit harder than she wanted to admit. The lawyer immediately switched to threats. Lawsuits. Damages. Injunctions. Court orders. He delivered the usual speech professionals give when they hope legal vocabulary alone will scare someone into surrendering. When he finally finished, I handed Denise a laminated folder. She opened it and stared. Inside was a detailed invoice. Towing expenses, lost wages, administrative costs, property harassment damages, consultation fees, and attached behind everything else was a proposed new lease agreement. The monthly rate was 3 times higher than before. Denise's eyes widened. This is ridiculous. Maybe, I replied. So was towing my truck. The meeting ended exactly the way you'd expect. More threats, more outrage, more promises of legal consequences. Then they left. I went back inside and made dinner. The following 2 weeks were some of the most entertaining weeks I've experienced in years. Every day seemed to bring a new crisis. Contractors dug trenches. Technicians replaced equipment. Consultants billed thousands of dollars. The HOA maintenance budget began hemorrhaging money. Residents attended emergency meetings demanding explanations. Board members started blaming one another. Long-standing friendships fractured. Elections were threatened. Recall petitions circulated. The people who had once acted like neighborhood royalty suddenly found themselves standing in front of angry homeowners demanding answers. The irony was beautiful. The same board that preached accountability now wanted sympathy. The same people who enforced rules without discussion suddenly begged for understanding. As pressure mounted, internal divisions appeared. Some residents blamed me. Others blamed the HOA. More importantly, many began asking a dangerous question. Why had the board escalated a dispute over a truck in the first place? Once that question entered the conversation, everything changed. Suddenly homeowners started examining board decisions more closely. They discovered previous enforcement actions, selective rule applications, petty conflicts, expensive legal consultations. The truck incident became a symbol of broader frustration. Denise's authority began collapsing. By the end of the 2nd week, the board requested another meeting. This time they arrived without attorneys, without threats, without attitude. Denise looked exhausted. Frankly, so did the rest of them. We sat around my kitchen table. The conversation lasted less than an hour. They agreed to reimburse every towing-related expense. They agreed to remove all restrictions connected to my property. They agreed to recognize permanent exemptions regarding my vehicles and land use. They agreed to issue written acknowledgement that future enforcement actions would require proper legal review. Most importantly, they agreed to a revised telecommunications lease under my terms. 5 years of payments would be made up front. The monthly rate increased substantially. Additional protections were added. New access provisions favored me. Maintenance responsibilities shifted further away from my side. Denise barely negotiated. She simply wanted the nightmare to end. Eventually, paperwork was drafted. Signatures were exchanged. Funds were transferred. A few days later, I walked back to the relay enclosure. The same morning sun shined overhead. The same tower stood silently against the horizon. I opened the panel and restored service. Within hours, garage doors began responding again. Gates opened normally. Security systems reconnected. Smart doorbells resumed recording. Across Cedar Ridge Estates, modern life returned to normal. But something had changed. The illusion of control was gone. The board had learned that power isn't the same thing as authority. And authority isn't the same thing as respect. Respect has to be earned. A week later, I parked my old Ford pickup in its usual spot. The same spot where it had sat for years. Nobody complained. Nobody issued notices. Nobody called a tow company. As I climbed out and looked across the property line toward Cedar Ridge, I noticed something almost funny. Several residents waved. A few even smiled. Maybe they finally understood what their board never did. Communities work best when people talk to each other instead of trying to control each other. And if Denise learned anything from the whole ordeal, it was probably this: when you're looking for a fight, make sure you know who actually holds the leverage before you start swinging. Looking back now, the strangest part of the entire situation isn't the towing company, the HOA board, the legal threats, or even the fact that an entire neighborhood nearly came apart over one old pickup truck. The strangest part is how avoidable all of it was. If a single board member had knocked on my door and said, "Hey, some residents have concerns, can we talk about this?" the story probably would have ended right there. We might not have agreed, but at least there would have been a conversation. Instead, they chose enforcement first and communication second. That's a mistake I see people make everywhere, not just in HOA communities. They become so focused on winning that they forget to understand the person standing on the other side of the disagreement. From a legal perspective, conflicts tend to become expensive the moment people stop talking and start assuming. Once lawyers, fines, threats, and power plays enter the picture, everyone usually loses something, whether it's money, trust, time, or relationships. That's one reason these neighborhood disputes can spiral out of control so quickly. Nobody wants to back down because backing down feels like losing. But real leadership isn't about forcing compliance. Real leadership is knowing when to solve a problem before it becomes a war. The psychological side is even more interesting. This is a psychological trap that affects organizations, businesses, governments, and even families. When people gain authority over time, they sometimes stop viewing others as equals. They begin viewing them as obstacles that need management. The HOA board convinced themselves they were protecting community standards. In their minds, they were probably the heroes of the story. That's the dangerous thing about power. Most people don't wake up planning to become arrogant. It happens gradually. Small victories go unchallenged. Rules get enforced a little more aggressively. Questions get dismissed a little more easily. Before long, people stop asking whether they're being fair. They only ask whether they have the authority to act. The lesson here is that leverage often matters more than status. Denise had the title. She had the board. She had the meetings, the rules, and the lawyers. What she didn't have was leverage. The moment that reality became clear, the entire balance of power shifted. Now, before anyone jumps into the comments saying I should have handled things differently, that's a fair argument. Honestly, there were moments during those 2 weeks when I questioned whether I was pushing things too far. I won't pretend every decision was perfect. Anger has a way of convincing you that escalation is the only language people understand. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it isn't. That's part of what makes stories like this interesting. Different people will draw different conclusions. Some viewers will say the HOA deserved every second of the chaos. Others will say both sides should have compromised sooner. And truthfully, there's probably some validity in both opinions. What I do know is that respect cannot be demanded. It has to be earned through consistency, fairness, and basic human decency. The board wanted compliance without respect. They wanted obedience without conversation. That's a formula that rarely works for long. In the end, my truck went back to its usual spot. The HOA got its systems back. The residents got their normal lives back. And life moved on. But every now and then, when I park that old Ford in the driveway and see the sunlight reflecting off the faded paint, I remember how quickly ordinary people can create extraordinary conflicts over something that should have been solved with a simple conversation. Maybe that's the real takeaway from this story. Most neighborhood wars don't start because of property lines, vehicles, fences, or regulations. They start because people stop seeing each other as neighbors and start seeing each other as problems. Once that happens, everybody becomes a potential enemy. So I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have fought back the same way, or would you have taken a completely different approach? And if you were one of the residents living inside that subdivision, who would you blame more, the homeowner who pushed back or the board that started the conflict? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and honestly, that's what makes these discussions so fascinating. If you enjoyed this HOA nightmare and want more real-world stories involving property disputes, power struggles, neighborhood drama, and the unexpected consequences of bad decisions, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for the next one. Trust me, some people never learn the lesson, and those stories are often even crazier than this one.